Swedish Presidency has delivered on all its priorities.
The Swedish sounded proud and confident when summarizing the results of their own presidency. For the last 6 months, Stockholm held the steering wheel of the European Union throughout a perfect storm of challenges, from climate change to economic recovery. Press TV reported on how the Swedish presidency handled these challenges and how successful they were in doing it. The next few minutes are an invitation to recount some of the most important moments in what many have called a historic 6-month presidency. It all started in July with the most pressing, unresolved issue. 6 months ago, the Lisbon Treaty, the legal framework under which the European Union operates, was not ratified yet. This created a lot of problems. It delayed the appointment of the new European Commission, the executive arm of the European Union, and it threatened to make Commission President José Manuel Barroso a lame duck president. Barroso, on his part, tried not to dwell on pessimistic scenarios and urged for the speedy ratification of Lisbon.
Look, I usually don't comment on hypothetical questions. I think the sooner, of course, the better.
Barroso's optimism eventually paid off. He ran unchallenged for a second term and won. In October, the Irish, who had initially rejected the Lisbon Treaty, approved it in a second referendum. This left the Czech Republic the only remaining EU state to give its blessing. But Czech President Václav Klaus was critical, fearing that the new treaty would create a superstate at the expense of national governments. He demanded certain concessions. The European Council responded with guarantees that Lisbon will not lead to fresh property claims by ethnic Germans, whose descendants were expelled from former Czechoslovakia after the Second World War. After the Czech Constitutional Court ratified the Lisbon Treaty, Klaus had no choice but to sign it, and he did so reluctantly.
I expected this decision and I respect it, even if I don't essentially agree with its content and its arguments.
With the Czech drama now officially over, the 27-country bloc shifted gears, preparing for the historic changes introduced by the new treaty, such as the creation of 2 new positions.
Now the new President of the European Council will ensure continuity. The High Representative will assure coordination in our external relations. Now we will have a more democratic union.
A statement readily contested by experts, and the selection of 2 low-profile figures marked the first disappointment in the process.
It hasn't been an election, it has been a selection. It has been a messy process, and therefore some people were disappointed at the end.
But there was a much bigger problem. The European Union had effectively taken care of institutional problems on November 19th. 5 months after the Swedish had taken over the rotating presidency, and only days before the most complex multilateral deal ever attempted.
The fight against climate change has been on the top of the agenda throughout the Swedish presidency.
But time was running out. EU leaders worked non-stop to come up with a unified position ahead of Copenhagen, and this was the best they could come up with.
We renewed our offer to reduce emissions 30% provided that others make comparable efforts. And despite resistance from some corners, we put figures on the global financial need in developing countries to fight climate change.
After 2 weeks of media hype, intense negotiations and street protests, the outcome of Copenhagen was a 12-paragraph statement of intention. The so-called Copenhagen Accord was not a legally binding agreement, and besides being politically significant, it didn't advance the treaty process. Yet the European Union insisted it had done its part. Despite international efforts, there's still a gap between the total sum of pledges and what's really necessary to fight global warming. The expense was high, especially given the slowly retrieving economic recession. In 2009, the bloc's aggregated deficit in public finances reached 7% of GDP, or 3 times more compared to the year before. 20 out of its 27 member states are facing excessive deficit procedures. Despite some signs of economic recovery, the European Union continued to suffer from persistently high rates of unemployment. The jobless rate in the Eurozone reached 9.5%, putting the total number of unemployed in Europe at 21 million people.
Real economy will have to need much more time to recover.
Ironically or not, Sweden will be handing over the rotating presidency to Spain, the country with the highest rate of unemployment in the European Union. With the ratification of the Lisbon Treaty out of the way, Spain will have more time to focus on the remaining objectives: more stable economic recovery and a legally binding agreement on climate change. Anna Moore, Press TV, Brussels.